Morning, 15th August, 1947. Across Punjab and Bengal, people were celebrating. India is finally free. But there was one thing almost nobody knew that morning. On that very day, no one actually knew where the borders between India and Pakistan was. Well, Radcliffe had already completed the boundary on 12th of August, but the British government deliberately withheld the map. They withheld the map until the independence celebrations were over. Millions of Indians celebrated freedom without even knowing which country they now belonged to. That's the tragedy. This wasn't just an administrative delay. I believe it became the symbol of the entire partition process. A series of rushed decisions whose consequences even the people making them failed to fully understand. Well, in our previous episode, we answered a different question. We answered to the question as to why the Britishers has actually left India so quickly and so suddenly. But today we are asking a much more difficult question. And the question is, did partition could have been avoided? Did partition have to happen the way it did? And if not, at what point? Which decision actually changed the course of history forever? Well, partition is often told as a single story, as if it was caused by one man or one political party, or rather one irreversible mistake. But when you go back to the original documents, and when I say original documents, I mean the British cabinet papers, I mean the official transfer of power records, the memoirs of the leaders themselves, a very, very different picture begins to emerge, something that we are not familiar with. Partition wasn't the result of one decision. It was, I believe, a culmination of at least 5 separate decisions made by different people at different moments for completely different reasons. And perhaps the most fascinating part is this. At the time, every one of those decisions seemed reasonable to the people making them. And none of them believed that they were creating one of the largest human tragedies of the 20th century. Yet, when those decisions collided, they changed the destiny of an entire subcontinent. So instead of asking who was responsible, let's ask a better question. Which decision made partition inevitable? And I want to ask this question to the whole of India, and perhaps the people who are outside India who have interest in the colonial Indian history. Which decision, I repeat, which decision, or rather decisions, made partition inevitable? Because history isn't always shaped by villains. Sometimes it is shaped by ordinary decisions whose consequences nobody fully understands until it is far too late. March 1946, 3 senior British ministers arrives in Delhi: Patrick Lawrence, Stafford Cripps, and A.V. Alexander. Their mission was very ambitious, perhaps impossible too. They were sent to find a way to grant India their independence, rather long-due independence, without dividing the country. On 16th May 1946, they unveiled what eventually became known as the Cabinet Mission Plan. It was an extraordinary yet complex constitutional proposal. The proposal goes like this: that India would remain one united nation, but the power would be divided in a very unusual way. Instead of creating 2 separate countries, this was the solution they provided. They wanted that the provinces would be organized into 3 regional groups. Group A would include all the major Hindu majority provinces, while Group B and Group C would consist largely the Muslim majority regions, which includes Punjab, Sindh, the then northwestern frontier provinces, Bengal, Assam. And the idea was very simple. The idea was that if Muslim majority provinces were given enough autonomy, perhaps they would no longer feel the need for a special country called Pakistan. And for a brief moment, it actually seemed possible. It actually seemed possible because the Muslim League had accepted the plan on 6th of June. So did the Congress on 24th of June. For the first time in months, a united India looked achievable. And then everything changed. Everything changed on 10th of July 1946 when Jawaharlal Nehru held a press conference in Bombay. And when I say these minute details, I actually want people to ponder on such events because they actually changed the course of history. On 10th of July 1946, Jawaharlal Nehru held a press conference in Bombay. During that conference, he stated that Congress did not consider the provincial groupings to be permanently binding. Rather, he argued that the future Constituent Assembly should remain free. It should remain free to amend the arrangements as it saw fit. To many people, it sounded like an ordinary political statement, but certainly not to Muslim League. To Muslim League, it changed everything. From Jinnah's perspective, the very guarantee that they had convinced them to accept the Cabinet Mission Plan was suddenly becoming an option. Many historians see this press conference as the moment when the last realistic opportunity for a united India began to collapse. There are a few other historians who actually disagrees with it. They argue that the real disagreement had existed from the very beginning because Congress and Muslim League had always interpreted cabinet mission plans differently. The conflict was inevitable. The press conference was merely had exposed that inevitable conflict. Whatever the explanation was, the consequences were immediate. On 29th of July 1946, Muslim League immediately withdrew its acceptance of the cabinet mission plan. And just weeks later, on 16th of August, Muhammad Ali Jinnah called for Direct Action Day, a nationwide mobilization in support of Pakistan. These are real facts. The result of that was a catastrophic communal violence that erupted across Calcutta. And within days, thousands of Hindus and Muslims had been killed. This wasn't just a failure of one community, nor was it a fault of one political party alone. It marked the complete collapse of the last serious constitutional attempt to keep India united. A collapse made even more dangerous by decades of British colonial policies, the divide and rule policies. They actually wanted to divide the Indian communities into separate political identities for their own benefits, for their selfish vested interests. And this is what we got at the end of the day. To understand why partition eventually became acceptable to Congress, we have to step inside the government itself. In September 1946, the interim government was formed. I repeat, in September 1946, the interim government was formed and Jawaharlal Nehru was effectively made the head of the government. A month later, in October, the Muslim League finally agreed to join the interim government. On paper, it looked like a great progress. Muslim League is actually joining the interim government. But perhaps there was a hidden agenda behind joining the interim government. But according to many historians, this was just not happening. Instead of functioning as a united administration, the interim government became a battleground. The Congress and the Muslim League clashed over appointments. They clashed over everything, rather. They clashed over policies, they clashed over administration, and even over routine decisions. This made many contemporary observers believe that the Muslim League had actually entered the government not to make it work, but to prevent it from working. Whether or not that interpretation is entirely fair remains debated even today, but what is beyond dispute is the impact it had on the senior leadership of Congress. It actually bothered them, irritated them. Leaders like Sardar Vallabhbhai Patel had increasingly forcing Jawaharlal Nehru to confront this uncomfortable situation. What if a united India was simply ungovernable? What if major decisions required endless negotiations, constant deadlocks, or permanent political paralysis may happen? These were the questions that were actually concerning the Congress higher leaderships. Gradually, their thinking began to change. They started asking different questions. Would it be better to preserve a united India that could never function effectively? Or rather accept a painful division in exchange for a stable and a workable nation? Sardar Vallabhbhai Patel reportedly expressed his frustration quite bluntly during his conversations with Lord Mountbatten. He argued that the League was not only unwilling to govern, it also preventing Congress from governing. From his perspective, a smaller India that could effectively function was far more preferable to a larger India trapped in a perpetual constitutional conflict. And this marked a profound shift in the Congress's position. It is very easy at the hindsight to blame a particular political party, but why Congress actually accepted the partition. It was not their choice. It has never been a choice between good or bad, or black and white. It has always been a choice where you are in a dilemma. So far, many historians, particularly those writing from a Pakistani perspective, argue that this shift in Congress was just as important as the Muslim League's demand for Pakistan itself. Historian Aisha Jalal, for example, makes one of the most controversial arguments in partition historiography. In her book called The Sole Spokesman, she argued that Congress ultimately pushed more strongly towards partition because its leaders wanted a powerful central government. A loose federation, the kind envisioned under the cabinet mission plan, would have left too much authority with the provinces. She argued that that portion for Congress was absolutely unacceptable. According to this interpretation, it wasn't even Jinnah who rejected a united India first. It was Congress that decided a united but a weak federation was no longer worth preserving. Now, this remains a deeply contested argument. Many historians, even today, strongly disagree with Aisha Jalal's conclusion. In 1947, both sides has begun imagining very different futures for India. And those competing visions were becoming increasingly impossible to reconcile. Now we can come to the man whose name is mentioned more than anyone else's in the story of partition, and that was Muhammad Ali Jinnah. For many people, the story begins in 1940 at the annual session of Muslim League in Lahore, where Jinnah actually endorsed what became known as the Lahore Resolution. It was the first formal demand for a separate Muslim majority state in the northwestern and eastern India. For decades, this has been seen as the moment Pakistan became inevitable. But modern historians are far more unanimous. One of the most influential and controversial interpretation comes from historian Aisha Jalal in her book, The Sole Spokesman, where she argues that Jinnah never have intended Pakistan to be a fully independent nation in the way it ultimately emerged. Rather, she argued that the demand for Pakistan was initially a powerful bargaining tool. Its purpose was not necessarily to divide India, but it was to force Congress and the British to accept stronger constitutional safeguards for Indian Muslims within a united India, but a highly decentralized federal system. This is actually, Aisha Jalal argues, this is actually she believed that Jinnah never wanted a partition. According to Jalal, Jinnah's willingness to consider proposals like United Bengal suggests that his real objective was not territorial separation at any cost, but certainly he wanted a political leverage. However, many historians reject the interpretation. They point out that after 1940, Jinnah's public speeches became increasingly consistent in demanding Pakistan as a separate sovereign homeland for Muslims. But there is another part of Jinnah's story, one that often remained hidden, and I believe this could be a great anecdote for many people who are actually still in the video and listening to this commentary. In 1946, or rather I would say in June 1946, while negotiations over the cabinet mission plan were still underway, Jinnah's physician in Bombay, Dr. J. Ratanji Patel, examined an X-ray, which actually confirmed that Jinnah was suffering from an advanced tuberculosis, a disease that in that era, if you consider, was almost certainly fatal. Medical opinion suggested that Jinnah had perhaps maximum a year or two left to live. Yet this diagnosis was kept an extraordinary secret. Only a tiny circle of trusted associates knew the truth. Even Lord Mountbatten, who arrived in India as the last viceroy in March 1947, was never informed. Nearly 9 months had passed since Jinnah's diagnosis, and the man negotiating the future of the subcontinent had no idea that one of its central political figures was terminally ill. This secrecy later gave rise to one of the history's most fascinating what-if scenarios. In Freedom at Midnight, authors like Larry Collins or Dominic Lapierre argued that had Mountbatten known about Jinnah's illness, he might simply have delayed the transfer of power. If Jinnah had died before partition, they speculate that the demand for Pakistan might have lost its strength. Perhaps partition itself could have been avoided. It's a compelling theory, but it remains exactly that, a theory. Many historians are skeptical. Well, Jinnah's biographer Patrick French, among others, actually argues that the political momentum behind partition had already become too powerful by 1947, that even if Jinnah had died earlier, the forces driving the subcontinent towards division was already in motion. So you will always have two different kinds of opinion or thought process. But one fact is beyond dispute, and that is that Jinnah deliberately concealed his illness. Because Jinnah understood something profound, something profoundly, I would say, important. If his political opponents believed that Jinnah was dying, his negotiating position would weaken precisely when he needed to appear strongest. That was some character, my friend. Sometimes history is not changed only by decisions people make. Sometimes it's shaped by the secrets that they choose to keep. The rush, the abandoned plan, and the man who drew the border. Well, by March 1947, Britain had made one thing absolutely clear. It wanted to get out. The man sent to oversee the exit was Mountbatten, Britain's last viceroy of India. But as we discussed, that he arrived in Delhi with a single overriding objective, and that is to transfer the power to India, and to do it very quickly. But what many people don't realize is that the partition wasn't Mountbatten's first plan. Initially, another proposal was on the table. Historians of today often refers to the plan as Balkan Plan. Sometimes it's also known as the Dickey Bird Plan. Well, instead of transferring power to one united India or even to two dominions, Mountbatten's first proposal would have actually handed sovereignty directly to the individual provinces and the princely states. Imagine, Punjab could decide its own future. Bengal could decide its own future. And in effect, British India could have fragmented into dozens of Indian political entities, not two countries, but many countries. Now, looking back, it's difficult. It's difficult to imagine the chaos such a plan might have unleashed, but India could have resembled to the political fragmentation. India could have resembled the political fragmentation seen in parts of Europe after the collapse of old empires, a patchwork of competing states, each pursuing its own interest. India would never be the India what we witness today. Fortunately or unfortunately, depending on your perspective, the future never materialized. When Jawaharlal Nehru learned about this proposal, he reacted strongly. He believed it would completely destroy the idea of India as a single nation. Facing intense opposition, Mountbatten had to abandon his Balkan Plan. It became one of history's great roads not taken. Trust me. Instead, a new proposal actually emerged on 3rd June 1947 when Mountbatten announced what became known as the 3rd June Plan. Its core principles were quite straightforward. British India would be divided into two dominions, India and Pakistan, as we all know even today. But Punjab and Bengal would themselves be partitioned. And the northwestern frontier province would hold a referendum to decide which country it wishes to join. Well, the Muslim League accepted the plan on 9th of June, and the Congress did the same on 14th or 15th of June. And even Gandhi ultimately offered his reluctant acceptance. At that moment, partition became official. But one decision remained, and it would shape everything that followed. Originally, Britain had planned to transfer power in June 1948. That timetable would have allowed more than a year to organize its transition. Instead, Mountbatten made a dramatic change. He moved the date forward. From June 1948 to 15th August 1947, nearly almost 10 months earlier than anyone had expected. But the issue is why Mountbatten did that. Why? Well, Mountbatten later offered several explanations. Some of them were Britain was exhausted after the Second World War. The colonial administration was rapidly losing control. Huge amount of communal violence was spreading. The longer Britain stayed, the greater the risk of civil war. So he accelerated the process. Whether the decision prevented greater violence or intensified it, well, that remains one of the most fierce debates in the modern history. Years later, Mountbatten actually admitted something remarkable, and he said he had never imagined that so many people would abandon their home. He had not anticipated the scale of refugee crisis or the human suffering that would follow. It is a striking admission. One of the men responsible for overseeing the largest transfer of power in history had profoundly underestimated its human cost. And then came the final decision, one that would affect millions, and that is to draw the new international border. The Britishers actually appointed Sir Radcliffe, a respected lawyer. However, he had never visited to India before. And he was given almost an impossible task to complete, and that too within 5 weeks, my friend. To draw a boundary of Punjab and Bengal, two of the most diverse and densely populated regimes, in just 5 weeks. 5 weeks to divide villages, districts, railways, railway lines, rivers, farmlands, families, and communities that they had lived together for centuries. On 12th of August 1947, Radcliffe completed his report, but instead of publishing it immediately, the British government deliberately withheld the Boundary Award because officials feared that announcement of such kind would overshadow the celebration and trigger violence even earlier. So while millions are celebrating, as I already mentioned in the beginning, that while millions were celebrating freedom on 15th of August, they still didn't know which country they belonged to. Only on 16th and 17th August, after the celebration ended, were the new borders finally revealed. For somewhere between 10 to 15 million people, the consequences were inevitable. The consequences were immediate and almost overnight. They discovered that their homes, their villages, their families were now on the wrong side of the international border. History often remembers Independence Day as a moment of triumph, but for millions, the real story began only after the celebration, while the celebrations were over. So we return to the question we began with. Could partition have been avoided? Well, the honest answer is, it depends on which historians you are reading. For decades, the traditional Indian nationalist narrative has argued that the primary cause was simple. It was Muhammad Ali Jinnah's insistence on Pakistan and the Muslim League's demand for a separate nation. From that perspective, partition became unavoidable because political compromises had reached to its climax, to its limits. But many Pakistani historians and several modern scholars see the story very differently. Historian like Aisha Jalal, for example, as I mentioned earlier, she had an absolutely different idea. She had a different interpretation. So as the possibility disappeared, so did the last realistic chance. I believe that the debate remains one of the most influential debates in modern South Asian history. Other historians focus somewhere else entirely. Scholars like Yasmin Khan, who argued that the tragedy of partition cannot be explained by the decisions of 1946 and 47 alone. Its roots stretch back decades. It includes the British colonial policies, particularly the introduction of the separate electorates in 1909, which gradually encouraged Indians to think of themselves politically as members of different religious communities rather than as citizens sharing a common political future. From this perspective, partition wasn't created in a single year. It was a culmination of political structures that had been developing for generations. Then there are historians who place the greatest responsibility on Lord Mountbatten. They argued that his decision to accelerate the transfer of power, combined with the impossibly short deadline given to the Boundary Commission, left too little time for proper planning. Partition wasn't caused by one speech. It wasn't caused by one leader or one political party. It emerged from a chain of interconnected decisions. The collapse of the cabinet mission plan, the Congress's changing vision of India's future, Jinnah's political strategy, and the secret that he carried. He carried the secret regarding his health, along with Mountbatten's urgency, the rushed drawing of borders. Each decision taken on its own appeared rational to the people making it, but together they reshaped the lives of millions. History is often remembered through dramatic moments, yet more often it changes because a series of ordinary decisions gradually closes every other path. So on the 15th of August 1947, if I have to sum up, India awoke to freedom. Across the country, people celebrated the end of nearly 2 centuries of British rule. Flags were raised, crowds filled streets. Across the country, people celebrated the end of nearly 2 centuries of colonial rule. A new nation had been born. But during that very same week, the land celebrating independence was also being divided. For millions of people, the true meaning of freedom wasn't determined on the Independence Day. It was determined only after the celebration ended, when they finally discovered which side of the border their home now belongs to. So the next time someone asks you, why did partition happen? Be cautious of any answer that blames only one person or one decision or rather one political party. History is rarely that simple. Always remember that the partition of India was the product of 5 critical decisions. India became free, but at what cost? That needs to be kept in mind. So if you have followed this journey with us so far, I would love to hear your perspective on this. Which of these 5 decisions do you think changed the history the most? Let me know in the comment section. And if you would like to explore the evidence yourself, then all the major historical sources used for this episode are listed in the description below, because history is always richer when we read it for ourselves. Thank you so much.